Coming to the end of our quota here. I had some conversations yesterday with people about their papers. Glad to hear lots of good ideas and ideas for kind of nailing them down, right? That's always the problem. It's easy to come up with a lot of ideas. It's hard to organize them and to make good selections for the evidence and then hone your thesis so it's clear and original and realizable, right? It's where you can actually write a paper that works for you. That's the problem with when you like your argument is too general. You just like get lost because there's so much you can say. You got to get it in that balance point between general enough that it's interesting, right? You can't be like this period's out of place, right? That's not interesting, and yet at the same time you can't get too general where it becomes uninteresting because it's so vague. Right, so I was glad to hear that the people I talked to had been working on it, and if their work is indicative of what's going on, they should be good papers. Okay, about that, obviously, papers due a week from tomorrow by midnight, and so don't forget the deadline. Final office hours for the quarter are on next Tuesday at 3:30, 4:20. If you cannot come to those ones, you better contact me, and you're planning to, you better contact me right now, because otherwise you're going to miss out, okay? So talk to me then. Those are after class, obviously. Now, already one person has talked to me and said that she's coming, so do contact me immediately if you need to talk to me. Okay, of course you can email me too if you want me to look at your thesis or have a question with the paper or something like that, and like I said, I'll try my best to reply as soon as I see your email. The one thing is, leave like 24 hours so that I have time to reply. But I will try to reply as quickly as I can. I was thinking that I'm not sure what phone number I put in the syllabus, but given the circumstances, if you email me something and you don't hear from me, you could text me. I'm giving you that option. I think I put my mobile number in the syllabus, but in case, I'm just going to say it right now, 206-694-9100. You could always text me if there's some kind of issue. If I haven't replied, it's fine to do that. So if you find that helpful, if that's the way you communicate. That's the thing nowadays, right? People don't email anymore. They have other means of communicating, and email is kind of an old-fashioned form, it seems. So you can certainly do that. I use that I use that medium myself, and don't have any problem with it. So that's that. Just don't text me that I can't come to class. I don't need that. Don't need a lot of emails like that. Okay. And then the other thing is, besides the paper, right, there's the final participation survey. You already got one of them, and then the second one is coming. It's the same thing. Just tell me how you've improved your participation, and give me an example, and you are good. And then give yourself a grade, too. So when you complete that final participation survey and you upload your paper, you're done with the course. Except some people I know want to do the extra credit, and that obviously is another thing to deal with. I sent out an email about the extra credit, and I've also talked about it in class, which is read another novel that belongs to the category of Scandinavian crime fiction and write a brief 750-word response paper to it. The first half summary, second half a critical response. And what I said for critical response was you could think about themes that we've discussed in the course and link the novel to those themes or differentiate it from those themes. So for those who are so inclined or feel like they would like to try to improve their grade, that is an option for you. And the deal is I will add 0.2 to your participation grade, or rather to your final grade. So that's a pretty generous extra credit, I have to say. But you can really make a difference by doing it, right? But of course, it demands reading a novel, which takes a little bit of time, and then thinking about a response to it. So, and then the one thing I have to say is, in full disclosure, is that I do use those criteria for evaluation to look at it. So, if you just do a slapdash job and you like cut and paste some comment from Amazon in there, I'm going to know it and you're not going to get credit for it, okay? So please, if you do the extra credit assignment, do it in a reasonable manner. I don't expect your best work necessarily, but don't if you just kind of dash it off, that shows. And then you put me in a situation where I have to not give you credit for something that you maybe took the time to do, and that would be unfortunate. So meet the minimum standard. Okay. Keywords for today was our last keyword for the course, and I think it's one that's helpful for this novel, and one that can help us link it to the course. And also, we want to talk more about the novel in the end of the first part of the meeting today, and then our second hour as well. And the keyword for today is Antihero. The keywords on the website or on the Catalyst Share Space, of course, and I will talk a little bit about it now. And let's just start here. It's kind of it's a term obviously that it assumes another term, which is hero. Like if you think about literary criticism, the hero can just mean the main character, right, the protagonist, and it's not like a moral statement or something about that. But the way when we talk about an anti-hero, of course, you can think of the anti-hero as kind of a foil to the hero, who is different from the hero, and in that way highlights certain aspects about the main character. But I think the way I want to use it is to draw on sort of the cultural history of the hero as a kind of a figure, right? And that, of course, entails some idea of like what a hero is. So we can think about both those things here and think about all the characters in our novels in addition to Erlander, right, who's our sort of our hero in the sense of the main character, but also an anti-hero, I think, in the sense of many aspects of his character. So maybe we can just start with some notion of, in thinking of the anti-hero, is I'll get this bigger in a second, what's a hero? So take a minute to talk with someone sitting next to you and get one definition of the hero. So let's just start right there. What's a hero? Okay, I hear it. The volume is slightly gone down, so let's just hear what's a hero? If we think of that as a place to start. Yeah, Gabrielle. Someone that solves problems. It's actually an interesting way to think about it. I'll just say that this is like a kind of a narrative definition of the hero that we find in film a lot, where usually the psychology of the main character is defined by a challenge, a goal that they need to meet. We've touched on this idea of narrative in class. And so the hero then is the one who can solve that problem. That can be both the main character. We recognize that person because of their capacity to somehow find it within themselves to solve this problem. But also, technically, right, they're the one who we follow as he or she tries to solve that problem. You can think of, there's interesting ways to deal with that issue, though, right? Because the problem they need to solve can be very different, right? You could have, Bruce Willis trying to stop the terrorists, right? Alternatively, you could have what was his? I'm trying to think of some of these very dark comedies. I was thinking like the indie films of Todd Solondz, American filmmaker. He's got a film called Happiness where they're like one of the kind of heroes. It's a kind of an ensemble film, so there's not really a hero. But one of the one of the main characters is a child abuser who's kind of in love with the kid across the street, and he's trying to like seduce him, and so it goes through all these hijinks as he tries to, so it's like it's a classic Hollywood setup, right, where there's a problem that needs to be solved, and yet we would not think of that character, right, as a hero in the sense of someone who, right?
Dexter.
Yeah, Dexter, I was going to say too that, but let's hear more things. Yeah, Jennifer.
Someone like Hercules, strong, courageous, with like a tragic past.
Strong, courageous, tragic past, and you said Hercules, right? And I'll just mention that Hercules, right, and I'll just put classical, or how about we put antiquity, right? Because oftentimes our notions of heroism they're very ancient ones, right, that draw on notions of the hero from the past. Shuan?
There's the hero's journey, which is often closely tied to the hero.
Okay, so the hero's journey. Famously sort of codified by what's his name? Is it Graves? No. No, Fraser, James Fraser. No, it's not Fraser. That's the Golden Bull. But Campbell, right. Who is so often adapted. He took all these folklore texts and it's a sort of a structural analysis where he says, look, if we look at these stories of heroes, there's always the same pattern, right? The hero's separated. There's a call to action. The hero sacrifices, and then finally comes back to the community and is reabsorbed into the community. Right? It's like the Luke Skywalker version where all these things happen. And film writers have taken Campbell and kind of run with it. So you see that story pattern a lot, and that's an important notion of of the hero from popular culture that comes from that stuff. So this idea of the hero's journey comes from Joseph Campbell. I think it's called, what is it called? The Hero of a Thousand Faces? Is that the book? Okay, so others. Lots of people's hand up. I'm for Angela, right?
I was just going to say this associated with justice.
Justice, right? So that's like returning harmony. This is often what the problem is. There's some injustice that's occurred that someone needs to resolve, and it's the hero who's the one who takes up the call, right? Who's called to resolve that injustice. Cassie?
Usually fighting for something or someone other than himself.
Okay, so fighting for... Oh, did you get... Cameron had his hand up here in the front and got aced out. So the hero or heroine, right, is fighting for someone other than herself or himself. So there's like a notion of like the community. That's the justice thing, again, that Angela mentioned as well, where it's not personal advantage they're pursuing, but putting the situation right. Jake?
There has to be something to contrast the hero to make it a hero in the first place.
Okay, there's a contrast to the hero that shows us the heroism, right? So it could be that injustice they're fighting to resolve, but it could be another character who's trying to obstruct them. The wrong motives in one way or another become obvious. Hannah, you had your hand up for a while.
Just someone who does things in order to benefit others.
Okay, so it's that kind of other-centered action. Kaya?
Yeah, one of those 2 points is he's like the good guy versus the villain, and
So it's the hero is the good guy, right? Yeah, we can think more about it. Austin.
Also inspiring or role modeling.
Right, of course, this is like one of the things we think of when I say, my father's my hero, right? There's something about it. It's like an inspiration or something like that. Where, I mean, that's a good one maybe to think about. Pause for a second there. My father's my hero. I don't know what your relationship with your father's like, but, or your parents. But it's usually when you start to think about it over a lifetime, right? It's more complicated than that, right? That your father's your hero. You probably have some pretty serious conflicts with those parents, your fathers or your mothers, right? Whether they're your hero or not. And, can a hero, it raises I just give that example just to raise the question, is a hero kind of like this idealized type within which there is no wrong, or is the hero a more complicated figure who has flaws, right? People talk about the tragic hero or something like that in tragedy, right, where they're great and yet they have this fatal kind of weakness that causes them to fall, right? That's one thing we can ask. That's obviously very old. Tragedy goes back to antiquity too. Kalina?
I was just gonna say what you were gonna say, but like the Hercules here, actually Achilles had the heel or
Right.
something. They always have the flaw, and then people sometimes they look down on them, and then throughout their journey they prove themselves worthy.
Okay, so sometimes the flaw is there in order to overcome it, right? We can put. And in some ways, this is a sort of a more modern version of the hero, right? Where, when the obstacle is external, the bad guy trying to block the good guy, it's a fairly clear-cut case, right? But when it's internal against oneself, it becomes a more complicated terrain, you could say, for the hero. And as a result, right, it becomes self-understanding and so forth that are at issue. And so that's what people say that these tragedy is we can't have tragedy today in a way because tragedy requires someone who's greater than us, and we think of ourselves in a democratic society as equals. So you can't have tragedy when you think of oneself as belonging to a society of equals. If no one is the king, right, you can't have tragedy. But at the same time, tragedy is very modern in that it's about flaws and about problems and about complicated people. Kathleen?
With heroes, there's always an expectation for them to come out on top.
Expectation. Right, they will solve the problem. I just remember I was telling you about my daughter, the one who had frozen. She was like yelling in the theater and so forth. Like, she doesn't get that. She doesn't know what a hero is. That they're going to come out on top. And I always tell her that whenever she watches a movie. That that's the way movies are. The good guy wins. Which is it's in the drinking water, right? We just take it for granted, and yet it takes a while for a kid to learn that because through watching and reading stories and whatever. And but this is an important expectation, right? That the hero, what does the hero do? The hero wins, right? So Agnes.
Just like what you said earlier, they're kind of taken for granted. Heroes can go both ways. There are heroes that are on the surface that are kind of more noticeable. There are heroes that are also below the surface. Like, we're sitting here in a class, but there are military soldiers out there the same.
Okay, so we could say heroes can be prominent, right, or less obvious, right? So this is an interesting one, too, that maybe helps us turn to our main term, the anti-hero. What's the everyday hero? That Agnes it's a term we talk about especially, right, because of wars that the United States has fought recently where military heroism has been something that has been, received attention in the media and has been a part of, the fabric of American life because of the acts of servicemen and the sacrifices their family have made. And as a result, we have this notion of everyday heroes. In fact, I don't know I guess it happened a couple years ago, but Bob Stacy, who's the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, his son was killed in Afghanistan. He was in some out in the middle of nowhere, and he went to Roosevelt High School, and the dad, is like a big famous historian, the mom's a historian. You'd think, academic career or whatever, but he wanted to enlist, and he did, and then got killed in Afghanistan. Very sad stories like that. That's maybe a kind of heroism, right? To put your life on the line and then to pay that price. There's lots of people, many families have had those kinds of experiences in the last 10, 15 years in the United States, and as a result, we can talk about sort of everyday heroes, of course, and then when you make that kind of point, right, in a novel that wants us to look at different perspectives maybe on how we think about identities, of course, in the countries in which those wars are going on, and in Afghanistan or in Iraq, of course, there are many families who are making big sacrifices in terms of death and suffering because of the war going on around them, whether they're participants in it or not participants in it. And that, of course, involves a sort of a, you could say heroes. What is that? When people like this, you hear that on the news, right? It's like kind of a cliche every day. They're American heroes or every day. What is that? What is that? What are those qualities? Yeah, Jennifer.
What you said reminds me of the Japanese nuclear meltdown that happened last year.
Okay.
I remember reading an article about how the elderly volunteered to go clean up the radiation themselves or something because they knew that they didn't have much time left, so they sort of sacrificed themselves for the youth.
Yeah. So some notion of sacrifice. We had that. I think that Cassie and Jake pointed that out. Some idea of fighting for someone other than oneself, seeking to benefit others. Right. I think that's a big part of that notion of heroism that Agnes pointed to, where a deep sense of self-sacrifice, right, to give your life for someone else. I mean, that's what we think of as that kind of sacrifice. It's we all hope we would do the right thing, even if it maybe endangered our lives. But on the other hand, would you really? It's like, yeah. Anyway, I won't give an example, but there's you can think of those sorts of instances, and that's certainly when people talk about heroes in that way, that's I think what they're pointing to is that sort of an attitude, right? It's about an attitude and a set of experiences. So these are some ways of thinking about the hero. What about the anti-hero? Take a few minutes to do the same exercise, talking to people next to you. Come up with one idea of the anti-hero, and let's talk about what the anti-hero is. And my thesis here is that Erlander is an anti-hero, and that's why I have chosen this term to talk about him. So let's talk. What's an anti-hero?
Like it means it's like means to another. So long as it's good, I think it doesn't. Like that's it's pretty much like what he does is like he pretty much wants criminals that that's not right. You should be taking their life, but in a way stopping that person from killing you.
Okay, let's hear what people had to say here. Cassie, you got your hand up first.
So they just don't fight for justice and they don't have from a traditional perspective, they might fight for their own interests, but they're not necessarily bad.
So maybe there's not the same concern with justice. I mean, of course, then what do we mean by justice, right? But I think part of what you're saying is like particularist was a fancy way to put it, I guess, which is that there's a particular interest, there's a specific place where they're coming from, and they're fighting for that as much as anything else. So this would be, we could add to heroes then some kind of universalism, right? Where there's some idea that they're doing right, a right that everyone would agree about, and then the anti-hero in some ways, particularists, are fighting for something that may not be may not seem relevant to everyone. Or maybe it's a personal concern that's kind of overriding or something like that. Jake?
I think the perfect example of an anti-hero would be Han Solo from Star Wars.
Okay. And you want to tell us why?
Because he just kind of fights for himself. He's not, originally he wasn't really out to help them, he was out to help himself.
Okay. So he's like a mercenary who does good when put in the right, put in.
Right, but he lacks like the motives and the idealism and like, a sense of justice, which Thanks.
So he doesn't go there by his own choice because of a motive or because of a sense of purpose, but instead is sort of finds himself in a situation in which he's called upon or asked to do these things, which he kind of against his will does, and ultimately then plays an important role, right? So you can say that in a way, I mean, to go back to this Campbell stuff that came up before, right? Luke hears the call and responds to it. Han Solo hears the call and says, no thanks, right? And that's kind of his character. So that's a good, thank you for a little bit of Star Wars to help us sort things out here. Yeah, there's a clear sense of purpose that differentiates him. Cameron.
They're not always likable. They often have flaws such as they're heavy drinkers, or they're violent, or they're a vigilante. But they're not always somebody you root for, even if they end up being the one that saves the day.
Personal characteristics that are which word should I use here?
Undesirable.
Undesirable. In a way, morally objectionable somehow. But you said at the end about saving the day. What did you say?
Even though eventually they might be the ones that actually save the day, they still might not be your favorite character.
Right. Okay. Might be the one to save the day. Very good. Catherine. I'm sorry. Caitlin.
Kind of just adding on to that, they're usually their actions and usually the way they go about solving a problem is not always morally on the up and up. They tend to be more ends justify the means kind of characters.
Okay. Say less morally, should we say, defensible. Their actions and justify means, right? So you see right away, like a comment like that, very common in crime fiction to have these sorts of characters who we can't admire morally, and yet they sort of, by this pragmatic, rough justice, they're able to solve a problem that's bigger than they are, right? Or that is bigger than the character, him or herself. Other elements that came up. Hannah.
I like the anti-hero because it flies under the radar, like they don't get much attention.
Okay, less attention than the hero. Maybe put this in like a fancy way, not the archetype, right? There's sort of people who don't get the attention in the same way for their thing, right? And we can all think of these sorts of things. Actually, I was thinking about Agnes's comment before. Like if you read, I guess if you read obituaries of people who've died in action in these various wars, it's actually the anti-hero is a figure that comes up a lot, right? Someone who they weren't the typical soldier, right, or they weren't the kind of the typical military person, and yet, and then there's a sort of list of these things that they did or didn't do or whatever. And yet there they were, right? That they were. It's a kind of an anti-hero cast on a biography, right? Where they don't fit the model, and yet nevertheless there they were. And so this, it's interesting that what I'm kind of want to work up to is that kind of what Caitlin said too, that we have a kind of admiration for the anti-hero, even though there's all these things that are unlikable about him or her. And in a way, it reminds one a little bit of what actors say about playing villains. It's much more fun to play the villain. It's much more interesting to play the villain. The hero is there's this kind of type, right? That, and a sort of almost like a platonic aspect to heroism. It's like the perfect type. Whereas the villain is a much messier character, a much more complicated character, and as a result, a more interesting person in a way. Right? What drives them to their villainy? What drives the anti-hero to not conform to type and yet to fulfill the task? Tal?
Some of the anti-hero, they like to use the anti-hero because of the way the villain is, because they are too messy, and they are like something like sometimes the law cannot catch them, and then the hero cannot find. If it's not in normal sense, like example, like the gold one cannot like. They know that they are doing it, but that does not know can solve that problem. So they making the villains end up
All right.
to satisfy the reader, because they
Okay. Yeah, the anti-hero can understand things that the hero can't. Actually, your example reminds me of an essay that we've read in this class in previous times that I have omitted just because it's not super directly relevant. But that's Raymond Chandler's famous article from 1944 called "The Simple Art of Murder." And Chandler, you may remember, is very famous for he kind of was the one who popularized the hard-boiled novel, and he used that first-person form of narration to talk about Philip Marlowe, right? That was his hero. So Lady in the Lake, The Long Goodbye, these very famous hard-boiled novels in the 1940s that were adapted for the screen, and Chandler himself wrote for Hollywood. And so there was a lot, and there was other Dashiell Hammett, another famous name of hard-boiled writer, Maltese Falk, and these kinds of things, right? So stylized men in the 1940s who were like rough and ready and tough, anti-hero or anti-heroes. And Chandler in that essay, he says that he attacks the whodunit, the British whodunit, and it's like a charge of heroism, right? That these sleuths, they're these perfect heroes that they would get clobbered on the mean streets of the American city, right? Where the mayor may be bootlegging liquor and, the alderman may be bought. And he's got this kind of like idea of the corruption of American society that from our perspective looks very kind of quaint, right? We were talking about like House of Cards the other day where like we're so cynical that we think the whole thing's bought and paid for already, right? That's no surprise. So Chandler looks quaint in that context, but his anti-hero is he contrasts that hero against the perfect type of the whodunit sleuth, right? The Miss Marple or the Sherlock Holmes, who's like a mental machine, right? They have no flaws. Whereas the anti-hero, right? He's an alcoholic or whatever, can't deal. And yet, as Tao points out, that anti-hero, because of their problems, they know how to deal, right? They know how to deal with the real world, right? They're street smart. And that's what makes them anti-heroes, is that they don't kind of play by the rules, so to speak. Because they can understand things that the hero can't, they're able to solve problems that the hero couldn't. Excellent point. Yeah, Jennifer.
In relation to what you just said, us as the readers, in terms of novels, we can relate to the anti-hero better because of their flaws.
Okay.
As opposed to the hero who's beyond reproach of all their perfect qualities. I would kind of love to.
Okay, this is an important point. The reader can relate to the anti-hero better than to the hero, right? Because of his or her imperfections. And this goes actually back to Aristotle, right? Aristotle's definition of the hero is someone who is greater than us. They're at a higher moral station, and this is an existential station. This is what makes them a hero in the first place. They're like a god, right? Whereas, and that's of course in antiquity. There's a different kind of cosmology that people think about. Whereas the anti-hero is like us or even lower than us, right? Morally. Right, like Elizabeth Salander, she's a killer, she's a murderer. You said it in discussion, right? She's the criminal. We think of, maybe you have a criminal record, but we think of ourselves as sort of like, right? Everyone wants to think of themselves not a bad person, but the anti-hero in fiction, that character, the flaws are put in the foreground, and so and we can say, look at that, right? And what I want to ask you now, we'll ask another question to kind of help us turn to Erlander. But before, the question is, anti-heroes are really fashionable in the last 5 years. I think Susan just mentioned Dexter, right? Where the serial killer is the hero. Obviously, that's an anti-hero, right? Tony Soprano, right? These kinds of characters or others, what is it, Breaking Bad, or House of Cards I mentioned before. It's especially popular on television or even Danish television. People, we haven't really talked about television, but The Killing got adapted to in Seattle. Sarah Lund, the heroine, right? She's an anti-hero, right? Kind of like loose ends, a little bit unstable, wears the same sweater every time, and so forth, right? It's this kind of thing where the problems of the hero make her or him an anti-hero. And what I like to ask is, to help us turn to Erlander, is why? Why is the anti-hero so popular these days? Maybe you can think of other examples. Of course, the anti-hero is in some ways a much older character than that. You can think of like Dostoevsky's Raskolnikov, right? He's a murderer. And yet we go into his world to try to understand the kind of existential problems that cause him to choose to murder. So there's all other versions of the anti-hero that go way back, but the anti-hero is like enjoying a lot of popularity right now. Why? What do you think is some of the reasons? And that might help us begin to understand a little bit about our character, Erlander here. But so the question is, think about some anti-heroes that come to mind and ask yourself, why are they so popular now? Okay, take a few minutes to do that, and then we'll talk about it as a class.
You know what I mean? Like,
They're more confident.
breaking that. Oh, okay. You know, he lets Jesse go. You know what I mean? Like, it's a little like, we can realize, I think that's fine.
Artistically,
That's true. Like you said, yeah, make your art. No.
I heard lots of bits of good comments, so I want to hear what people have to say. One thing you could do, one first response might be that you're wrong, and that would be, it's like the periodization, the last decade. When does the anti-hero become more popular? I'm sure that people have written books about it. Maybe it's the 60s, the 50s to the 60s, where, you know, it's kind of the 60s revolution that starts to admire something else than the kind of the Cary Grant of the 1950s, say. Jack Kerouac, Sal Paradiso, that's an anti-hero, right, on the road. That's the late 50s, right? So, anyway, what did you say? Sorry. Shuan.
We thought that the anti-hero has been getting a lot more attention. More movies and television shows have been focusing on anti-heroes, and so we're starting to like them more.
So we like them more. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, I really want to say something about my own theories, but I'm going to let it go because we can talk about it. But it's pretty interesting. Like, you could think about it from the perspective of media history and what's happened in the last 10 years. That's where the anti-hero comes from. Angela?
I just wonder if there's been cynicism.
Cynicism. So you mean like in the culture at large?
Yeah, I mean, when you think of heroes, you can easily go back to possibly movies or Disney or something and think of not really, and like really straightforward. And we already came up with a list of like a lot of stereotypes.
Uh-huh.
But I think an anti-hero can have so many problems that they might seem unrealistic.
Okay, so cultural cynicism suits the many problems.
Well, it just seems like the regular hero might, in some cases, be too simple to.
Okay, so the hero is because of our cynicism as a culture, we can't believe in the hero, and so we look to the anti-hero as an instance of some kind of plausible figure, right? Agnes?
I'm not sure if people have seen Gossip Girl or not, but we were actually Googling on like examples of some anti-heroes. But because we're kind of in the modern age of like accepting more differentiated characters, and we don't want the same old, lovable romantic character, but it's that Chuck Bass character that's kind of the badass, but he's almost so badass that you think he's bad, but he is a good guy, so he's got that like anti-hero characteristic. And so we want like a different image.
Yeah, it's interesting to put it that way. Bad with some redeeming characters. Like one thing you could say, like again, the media history angle. This is not the one I had in mind previously, but right. One thing you could say is that advertising has co-opted bad. Right, advertising likes to sell us, use the image of the bad boy or the bad girl to sell a lot of things. The nonconformist, right? If you're a nonconformist, then you'll buy Mountain Dew. And so there's like a notion of the antihero as the good consumer, right? That's what I just think. What I think when I think of bad, but with some redeeming characteristics, right? People say there's the co-optation of cool or whatever. What's cool? To kind of be an outsider, and yet when Madison Avenue or whoever they make of advertising these days realizes some office park wherever, right? When they realize how that bad actually is a better sales tool than the hero, right? Instead of getting heroes on the commercials, right? We get badasses on the commercial who say, I'll beat you down and you should buy Mountain Dew, whatever it is. You can think of all these examples from commercial media that in the way that works. Gabrielle?
So similar to like how we can kind of relate to these anti-heroes more than we can an actual hero, I think there's that relatability and then also a tiny bit like of a sympathy when they're like getting into some of these problems. The sympathy for like the things that don't go well for them, and then kind of in turn kind of like also just like wanting them to be successful, like wanting them to win. Like if you think of Breaking Bad, like those terrible things, like you go through all the seasons, like he murders tons of people.
Yeah.
Like you still want him to win at the end. You don't care.
It's bizarre. It's bizarre.
Like,
Yeah.
you gotta win.
If you, and it is a strange kind of thing that what the changing tastes that people have, right, or that a culture has, that there's that sympathy for the anti-hero. I was thinking like sympathy, like what kind of sentiments do you have? Also, there's the idea like sometimes you like to see people fail because you can say to yourself, glad it's not me, right? So there's both a sympathy like I hope they can pull out of it, but also like you go, right? Let where you're like you're glad it's not you, and that's a part of the anti-hero as well. Like someone has it worse than I do. There's a sort of a consolation in that, right? And that may, then people can make arguments with that, like that has to do with bad economic times or sort of a situation where there's a lot of people in distress of one kind or another, under pressure, feeling stress. You could like link it to modernity, in general, right? Where, if suddenly, if you look at, I don't know, people make the argument, there's been these books recently, books about American public culture about changing gender roles, right? Where now, because of increases in cost of living, inflation, you need to have two incomes basically, where 50 years ago you had to have one income in a household, right? And so people are working, trying to keep up. They're under stress all the time. They're trying to get this done, that done, right? And as a result, they're feeling bad all the time about how they can't keep up and how they can't do what they want and so forth and so on. And so these anti-heroes fit that mood better and those life experiences than people who could be in more repose. And so that's just an example of how you could make the link to changes in lifestyle. Ben?
So I would say anti-hero is LeBron James.
Okay.
He's like the person that everybody wants to hate, but then everybody, like if he leaves Miami to go to like any other team, he's the person everybody wants. Like everybody wants him on their team, but he's the person that everybody wants to hate.
Okay, so LeBron James. So, but he wants
So like, all right, so I explained that for you. All right, so essentially, he's the person that everybody just like. Not anymore, but ever since 2010 when he left Cleveland, like everybody across the U.S. just disliked him, and he's the person that everybody. Okay,
so he betrayed Cleveland. Right. So it's very. Is it spelled? Is it EAV? I can't even. Okay. But like these sports heroes, right? One of the things we bring up right away too is that one thing we haven't talked about is gender. Right, and LeBron James' race. Right, I was just thinking of the Richard Sherman comments. Right, his rant after the game against the 49ers, right? And then people calling him thug and all these kinds of things, right? And then he speaks in the media and he's like got a Stanford degree and he's like some brilliant intellectual kind of guy. Where those kinds of notions of the hero in American culture are strongly linked to notions of race and gender, right? Who can be the good guy? Who can be the bad guy? Who can be the hero? Who can't be the hero? And so we haven't really talked about that, but the LeBron example, right? What love to hate him, these kinds of things. It in some ways is race a question. There is one of the things I'm just pointing to here. Hannah.
I think sometimes the hero is always like made out to be so much better than everyone else because they're like helping everyone else, but the anti-hero is more like can be more relatable to people.
Yeah. Right. Anti-hero. I mean, it's one of the things about heroism, right? Is that you don't get that opportunity very often to actually do things for others, like not just for your family, but how many people have like a real chance to like do something for humanity, right, or do something for the nation or whatever. I mean, we can do it in small ways, perhaps, but you don't find yourself in that situation very often. Much more often, you're like pursuing your own little thing, right, that you got to do for whatever reason. And so the anti-hero is relatable or we can relate to him or her as Hannah suggests. Caitlin?
Because an anti-hero doesn't really have to play by any particular set of rules, you can have much more varied plot lines. I mean, in stories that vary a lot more, as well as because they don't play by the rules, you can really challenge social conventions or really make a statement about society as it stands using them. Yeah,
this is actually kind of I was going to make the same point in that first thing about media history, and that is the anti-hero comes with the rise of cable television series like The Sopranos, because the things the writers want to write about are the interesting characters, and if you have these kind of idealized heroes, the Supermans, they're not interesting to write about, and so you cannot squeeze 5 years of Byzantine drama out of them. But an anti-hero, you can, right? When you just get further deeper into the closet, they're more interesting characters in a way. Because of why are they more interesting? That's part of what we're asking. But Caitlin puts it in a narrative way, varied plot lines and challenge social conventions, so you can kind of deal with some of the lines, some of the assumptions, some of the problems in society. And that's why, look at all these things, like Californication, Breaking Bad, House of Cards, Sopranos, Sex and the City, even something like that. That's kind of like they're in some ways conventional heroes, but they're not conventional heroes, right? Because they're like women who are too old, basically, right? Even though they're normative beauty, whatever, but there's a sense of they're too old, and so they're kind of anti-hero. They're cast against type in a way. But in all those examples, there's a lot of plot lines and challenges to social convention that you can work out through the figure of the anti-hero. Austin?
I think there's also been a lot of these politics, especially there's been a lot of gridlock, and these anti-heroes can break through it by so we're willing to excuse the bad things we do, like Underwood and House of Cards. We're willing to excuse the bad things he does because he does something, he gets something done. Or in crime shows, the criminal doesn't get away, so gridlock.
Okay, good point. So, one thing that Austin points to is like a general sense of kind of like malaise, like we're at the end, like what's happening, we're just stuck, right? Stuck in the mud somehow. And so the anti-hero is someone who doesn't use the accepted methods, and can break the log jam, right? Change the game in the political kind of cliche. And so we're interested in those characters who want, in a way, the anti-hero is like some version of the Messiah who comes and saves us from ourselves. We're stuck. And here comes this person who uses different methods and changes things for us by, breaks the game. Michael, do you have your hand up back there? Okay, I'm sorry. You was one of the first ones up, and I didn't get back to you. Other hands up here. Nancy?
I think that to have a hero, you need to have a private life, and I think that the internet has brought about the demise of private lives, that we know too much about everybody.
Okay.
And so that you can't have white hats and black hats, that everything's kind of gray.
Okay, so
is subject to criticism. Do we have any heroes left?
Okay, this is an interesting point too, right? Here, in other words, like the assumption is that or the hero requires some secrecy or privacy. What does that mean? The assumption there is in a sense that everyone has these problems, right? Or weaknesses, imperfections. And the hero is just better at hiding them, right? And it depends on a world in which we kind of block off certain parts of the self and say we don't talk about that. But in our world where everything is kind of in the light all the time in various ways, and we expect that, we know everyone has a problem. So what we become is we're not interested in the walling off the problems. We want to see the problems. We want the problems to come into light. And so there's a fascination as a result with the anti-hero, because here his or her problems are in plain view, and they're loving it. They're using those problems to make money or solve problems or whatever it is. So the anti-hero is becomes, in a sense, greater than us because they affirm their flaws. It's like that Nietzschean figure, remember we were talking about the other day, right? That they're not scared to act out in the way the rest of us are. They affirm their problems and use them to advance their own interests or whatever. Susan?
Yeah, and I think it must go along with the two-dimensionality of current hero movies when you've got they're all comic books.
Okay.
So the nuance is now on the anti-hero side instead of on the Greek tragedy side, where even Greek heroes were nuanced and had flaws, but we don't think of them as that.
In a way, maybe the anti-hero is interesting to us because heroes have become so hollowed out and uninteresting, right? If you think about, you mentioned movies, but one of the things that's happened with the movies, right, is that Hollywood has become extraordinarily conservative in the last 10, 15 years. And by conservative, I don't mean politically, but sort of aesthetically. That they only make a certain kind of movie, these huge films based on pre-sold products, whether it's The Lord of the Rings or whatever, that everyone knows already, Harry Potter, that they bring to the screen, Spider-Man 4 or whatever, that we all know what they are, and they're able to market them easily and effectively. They can put a ton of money into them. The attraction is in some ways in the tricks that they do and the stars that they cast. And as a result, the characters themselves are not interesting, right? And so what we look to the anti-hero then for as something interesting in that way, then the anti-hero is the exception, something that is a little bit of a niche figure. We're kind of out of time here, so we can pick up in talking about the anti-hero more and talking about Erlander, who I think is a pretty clear anti-hero for us. And we'll do that after. Let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll start at 25-2 and talk about Erlander as anti-hero.